when I interpret Einstein and talk about him, which I do very frequently, I did have his personal approbation of my capability to do so. So I'm giving you then a hypothetical example of what Einstein employed as a strategy of thinking, which brought about Bridgman's development of the word operational. But it was interesting to me that I heard from this man 2 years before the theoretical fusion is envisaged, that he did not have any slight idea that anything he had ever done would have any practical application, because the first practical application, the Enrico Fermi pile, completely validated his theory of the amount of energy that was being stored in a given mass. So the very essence of what was going on. So the first practical application was Hiroshima. And having heard that from that man just before this occurred, I realized the unhappiness and consternation that he experienced when the first practical application was Hiroshima. In fact, his last days were spent greatly devoted to trying to get the scientists to realize their responsibilities and how they were being exploited, and brought about, his consternation brought about the development of there was an Association of Atomic Scientists and the publishing of the Atomic Scientists Bulletin and so forth. And then there was a whole set of events which followed, which most people are very familiar with, and then the German scientists, Jewish scientists, getting the word as quickly as they could out of Germany, because they thought it would be used immediately for armaments in Germany. And the word did come to America, and there were theoretical studies, and then came the conclusion of the scientists that fusion was actually possible. So there was the quandary of the scientists, and how, because politicians don't listen to the scientists, on how to get word to Franklin Roosevelt. So they all decided that Einstein was by far the most highly accredited of scientists, so they asked him to go to see Franklin Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt did appropriate what at that time was an incredible amount of money, $85 billion for the Great Manhattan Project. And then ensued the Enrico Fermi pile, with all of which history most of you know. His equation had not as yet been validated as it was later by fusion at the time that I was writing. Anyway, he said he did approve of my 2 chapters, my chapter explaining how his philosophy was interpreted in his action, his thinking. But he said this 3rd chapter about Mr. Murphy's horsepower, and his words were, I will imitate him because I remember this so very well, and he was very gentle, and he said, this 3rd chapter, young man, you amaze me. I cannot conceive of anything I've ever done having the slightest practical application. And he went on to explain that he had evolved his thoughts as possibly being useful to the astronomers, to the astrophysicists, to the cosmogonists, the cosmologists, but that it have any practical application, nothing. And he did approve, and they did go on with the publishing of the book. This is very interesting because this meeting occurred about a year and a half before Hahn and Stresemann and then Lisa Meitner discovered theoretical fusion. I had a 3rd chapter, which I said that historically great scientists, individual scientists make discoveries. The academy doesn't accept right away. Later on they do accept. Then it gets to be in the schools, and this gets to be into in the general atmosphere of everybody's thinking. At this point, engineers and inventors within that atmosphere of thinking make some invention, and then gradually some industry takes on that invention. That takes quite a while. There's a lag. Finally, various things are being produced, and which bring about a new environment under which social changes have to occur, and politics then has to take care of the take-up on the new orientation of man, all brought about indirectly from the original scientist thinking. And I said, Then my third chapter was, I developed a hypothetical picture of how humanity would be living. It was called E equals MC, second power, equals Mrs. Murphy's horsepower. And then I was looking at the everyday life of Mrs. Murphy under the circumstances of everybody really being completely convinced of the validity of Einstein's thinking. He immediately excused himself from the company and took me out to a little library that was just off the main hall of the apartment. And on the library table was my typescript and under the light, and we sat down on either side of this desk, and he said he'd been over my typescript, and he was writing to my publishers to say that he approved of my interpretation of his thoughts in the way in which I had explained his translation of philosophy. A philosophy of his which had been published in the New York Times Sunday magazine, New Year 1930, called The Cosmic Religious Sense. It's a very, very inspiring piece. And I had asked the publishers if I could quote it in my book, and I did. Having then this chapter on his philosophy, I then had another chapter on the way I felt that he interpreted into how he applied that philosophy to all of his own grand personal strategy of his life, and how he came about developing his thoughts on an equation. And so I was a little stung, and was still quite young, and so I simply wrote back, in a sense quite facetiously, to Lippincott, saying that Dr. Einstein had just come to America and was in Princeton at the newly organized Institute for Advanced Study, and I suggested they send my typescript to him, that he would be the best authority. I really did not think they would take me seriously about that, and I forgot all about it. And it was about 6 months later that I had a telephone call from a doctor in New York, and he said, my friend Dr. Albert Einstein is coming in to spend the weekend with me, and he has your typescript, and he would like to talk to you about it. And could I possibly come on Sunday evening to his apartment in New York? So you imagine I didn't have any engagements that would interfere. And I had very few engagements in those days. Nobody wanted to talk to me. And I did come then to the apartment, and it was a wealthy man, and he had a large living room, and in more or less Germanic kind of style, people were sitting around the walls of the room, and he was sitting pretty much in the middle, and I think later on he might have played music for them. And when I came in, I was brought then to this long room up to meet him. And I really had, I don't know how much was psychological within me, but I really had the most extraordinary feeling of being in a presence of almost an aura of him. The example that I'm going to give you is my own invention, but I did include Einstein and Einstein's philosophy and my own interpretation of how he came to develop his equation and other of his strategies in my first book, Nine Chains to the Moon. And because I had 3 chapters on Einstein, my publishers, who were Lippincott of Philadelphia at that time, this is mid-30s, about 1935, said that they found that I had 3 chapters on Einstein, and at that time there was a sort of a general myth that there were only 9 people in the world who could understand Einstein. They said they looked at all the lists of people who understood Einstein. I was not on any of the lists. In fact, they didn't find me on any list and of any authority, and they felt that for me to be writing 3 chapters on Einstein would make Lippincott be accused of being a partner to charlatanry, that I was just a faker.